I record these videos early in the week, and this week it's Tuesday. That's pretty early for me, but next week is Holy Week, with Sunday being Palm Sunday. And so I'm trying to get a jump on things. But it's going to be a very full weekend, and Palm Sunday is a big part of it. But let me start with Saturday. Saturday is a return of the No Kings protests. And the last one was in October, October 18th. And I uh, went to see what was going on in Westchester, in Chester County, where Phoenixville is located. What I saw was a very peaceful, but very discontent crowd. And one that was expressing its discontent, its disapproval, and some of its hopes by getting out into the streets and, in the case of Westchester, in a very orderly and very calm and, in many ways, a humorous sort of a way. One of the funny things I saw was this. It's a poster of Antifa. You'll notice she's holding an NPR tote bag. That's a lot what that crowd happened to be like. It wasn't until about 6 or 8 days later that it was made public that the police had found someone in that crowd who was armed and dangerous. They stopped him before he actually got close to the center of things. And when they got a search warrant, they went back to his house and they found several pipe bombs and other munitions. And he was charged, and everything was safe. Nothing happened, but we never really found out who this guy was or much about him. It wasn't all over the news. And when I think about Palm Sunday, I think it was something very much like that for a variety of reasons. For one thing, it was a day that had a lot of both religious and political overtones. I don't remember who it was that I heard say this or whose work I read it in. I think it might have been John Dominic Crossan, but I could be wrong, who pointed out that every year when they expected trouble on Passover, the Roman governor, who normally would be closer to the Mediterranean coast, traveled up to Jerusalem, to the center of religious observance for Jews worldwide, but especially for the people in Judea, where he knew there could very well be trouble. It was a holiday that celebrated God's liberation of the people from slavery in Egypt. And it naturally had overtones that would be heard by the worshippers of God who were being oppressed by the Romans. And if you put a bunch of people like that together, and some of them in the crowd armed, that was not in question, that was known, a group called the Zealots. You put all of them in the temple, and you start reminding everybody that God had acted and would act to free his people. Add to that the expectation of a Messiah, and you have a recipe for not just a no King's Day, but a no Caesar's Day, but one where they were expecting a king to come in and take over and be the real king instead of Pilate, the governor, ruling on behalf of Caesar. So here's the part that I'm saying ties in with the other. Um, when he rode from the capital, the military capital, to Jerusalem, Pilate would make a great display of his power and his strength and the authority and splendor and glory and might of Rome. And he would go right through the main gate and travel to the military installation that was right next to the temple. The one with the walls that were tall enough that archers could aim down into the outer court of the temple if they had to. But when Jesus entered, he entered from the other side of town without a lot of warning, not on a war horse, not heading in from any sort of place except some undefined spot out there outside. And it was kind of a ragtag sort of a procession. Almost, here's the part that I wish I knew who had suggested, almost as a parody of what Pilate did every year. Setting up a picture, making fun of, let's put it that way, making fun of the Roman spectacle. Now, in our own day, we know what happens when a slightly insecure ruler, let's say a government official, feels that they are being mocked. Say that there's one who dances, but not very well, and somebody, another government official in another country even, goes out and dares to sort of make fun of the way that the other one dances. This is all very seventh grade stuff, but it might be enough to cause use or abuse, misuse of military forces to get even with the other guy. So, was Jesus setting up a protest? He didn't ride to the Antonia fortress, he rode to the temple, not to the place where there would be soldiers stationed, but to the place that the soldiers were keeping an eye on. We don't know. It was a very, very difficult situation to read. It's even harder for us now when we don't catch all the overtones for sure. Everything I just described might be totally wrong. But I find it kind of convincing. And the big question in all of that is going to be, who is this person riding in on a donkey? And what's going on with him? In the crowd on Palm Sunday, there were people as varied as there would be in the crowds out in Westchester in October. There would have been people who were cheering for Jesus, some of whom thought he might be the Messiah sent by God to free his people from foreign rule, exactly the person that Pilate would have been scared of. Some of whom may have thought that he was the Messiah sent by God to cleanse the temple from abuses that had turned faith into a business, and who would have been happy that the first place he went was the temple. Some of the people cheering probably thought of him primarily as a healer. Maybe some of them thought he was just another ambitious politician out for power and status. Some of them probably thought he was a charlatan or a crazy man. I mean, who would make fun of the Romans if that's what he was doing in that way? And I think it's fair to say that some of them probably may not have cared at all who he was, but just kind of enjoyed the excitement. Matthew describes the whole thing, and I'm going to read bits and pieces of his description. When he, Jesus, entered Jerusalem, he said, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" Now, that question had been following Jesus for a while, and he knew it. Earlier in Matthew's Gospel, we read of a time when Jesus raised the subject with his closest followers. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Well, Jesus called himself the Son of Man here, which was one of those enigmatic terms for an end of times figure that commentators never really have gotten a full handle on. Probably people at the time weren't quite sure. They used the term loosely. It shows up in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus applies it to himself, probably meaning one who embodies humanity. Jesus also had been associated with John the Baptist, who had confronted both Herod and the authorities in the temple. Elijah, he had been a prophet who had called out the corruption of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Other prophets, Jeremiah, had warned about how societal rot was leading to destruction of both the temple and the kingdom, and would live through the early portions of the exile and die having been kidnapped from Jerusalem by people who were fleeing and who thought they wanted a prophet to go with them. What were they saying about Jesus in his day at that time? It's pretty clear that at least some people were expecting something dramatic from him. Who is this? They were asking. And Jesus added on to their expectations by acting out the words of the prophet Zechariah. Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. That was part of the procession. Matthew says that when Jesus had entered Jerusalem, as I said, he continued on up to the temple and proceeded, once he got there, to disrupt long established practices by driving out the animal sellers and flipping over the money changers' tables. Excuse me, that was a slip. And then he left. But the next morning, he had the gall to return and to start telling parables right there. about God ending the current order and judging the world. And that sounded great, unless you were in charge. And it sounded great, except that in the parables he told for the next couple of days, the judgment that he announced was to begin with Jerusalem, not with Rome, not leaving anybody out of it, but starting at home. That didn't follow anybody's script. And the question, who is this, was turning into the question, just who does this guy think he is? And that was Monday. Tuesday was more the same, with some disputes between Jesus and the members of the two main religious factions in town, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He didn't take sides with either group, and he had things to say about both of them. By Wednesday of that week, it was clear that the situation was coming to a crisis. Matthew tells us when Jesus had finished saying all these things, these parables he had been offering, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." Well, that was the night that Judas agreed to turn Jesus over. And the next night, he found his chance. Who is this? Arrested, Jesus was tried by the religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, a court that was presided over by the high priest. Matthew says, "Then the high priest said to him, 'I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God.' Jesus' answer was enough. 'You have said so.' They sent him to the Romans, to the governor, Pilate. Pilate had entirely different concerns. Pilate had entirely different worries, but he had the same question. "Who is this?" he demanded of Jesus. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." Again, his answer was enough. And so, condemned first by religious authorities and then by civil authority, he was sent off to his execution. Who is this? The Roman soldiers who nailed him to the cross were ordered to put a sign up over his head detailing his crime. And it wasn't something that he had done. It was who he was. "This is Jesus," the sign said. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then the soldiers stood guard to make sure that he died. Who is this? And of all the people who had gathered around there, the people in the crowds, the people in the Sanhedrin, Pilate, the crowds outside, the crowds gathered around the cross, of them all, it was the people that had nailed him to the cross who were given an answer. that would take in all the other answers that had been given previously. They saw the world change. They saw the world change in fearful and in hopeful ways, and in fearful ways, and in hopeful ways, and in fearful, hopeful ways. They saw the simplicity and the enormity of all of it. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened. Many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. But for now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." And that was it. That sums it all up. The one who came, the one who saved, the one that people were calling for was the one who showed up. The Messiah, the King of the Jews, the healer, the teacher, the reformer, God's own Son, the judge, not taking sides, the resurrection, and the life. Truly, this man was God's Son.